All right, welcome back everybody to the Farmer Friday call. I'm Jessica Gnad, your host. I'm with PrairieFood, the Director of Marketing. And today it is a great pleasure of mine to feature one of my really good buddies, Dale Strickler. So Dale, welcome to the line here.
Hi.
Hello. All right, so if you've been following along with us the last couple weeks, we started off 2 weeks ago with Brandon Hunnicutt, a Nebraska corn grower, and we had a fantastic conversation with him, including topics like the climate smart commodities and farmers for soil health. So that was really fantastic. You can find it on YouTube. And then last week we talked to Kansas producer Todd Tobin. He's in the Pratt, Kansas area, so he's west of Wichita, about an hour. And he is doing soil health at scale. He talked about different conservation programs that have helped really just propel him into the next phase of his farming operation. And this week we have my good buddy Dale Strickler. He is the author of several books, and he pays me, I think we're up to $20 each time I promote your book, right, Dale? Like, this is another.
The check is in the mail.
Checks in the mail. So he's got Managing Pastures, the complete guide, and then Drought Resilient Farm. And then he's got a new book about regenerative agriculture that's out. And these are just fantastic books that really early on when I was learning about soil health, these books were very instrumental to me. Coming from a person that didn't have a traditional agricultural background, I was able to really pick these up and understand the topics. And then next week, we're going to be talking to Jimmy Emmons. He's an Oklahoma producer, and he will be talking a lot about the changes he's made in his operation and some really amazing things that he's able to do as an advocate for farmers, but farmers and soil health and regenerative ag. And he is also one of my good friends here. So I'm just going to give you a few more things here, and I think we can keep going. So we already did that part. Helping me out today is my buddy, Drew Minnis. He's out of Lawrence, Kansas, and he works for PrairieFood. He's on the communications team and gets to work a lot with data. And he is our Zoom ninja, working behind the scenes, making sure that everything runs smoothly. So thank you for being here today, Drew. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, if you have any questions, any technical questions, just shoot them to Drew. And then also he'll be responding to some of your questions. If you have any specific questions, just go ahead and tag him in the chat and he will get you going. So I do work for a company called PrairieFood, and we focus on a triple bottom line of the people, the planet, and being able to provide that economic viability and profitability for all farming operations. So I'm actually going to stop my share and get right in to our speaker. So Dale Strickler, where are you calling in from today?
I am sitting in Arnold, Nebraska right now. Just got through visiting with a client this morning, and they dropped me off here, and so I am in my studio, as you can tell, and my studio slash living room, I guess. So dining compartment, whatever you want to call it.
It looks very first class.
And it gets 51 miles a gallon, so it's hard to complain. But
well, I'm glad you're not driving while you're doing it. So
yeah, I can't walk and chew gum at the same time, so I'm not a multitasker. I'll focus on the task at hand.
Nice. So. Well, I'm going to go ahead and let you just take over here, and I think you had a couple things that you wanted to hit on as we get going, but yeah, take it away, Dale.
Yeah, well, what I wanted to focus on, well, first of all, I need to announce that I do work for a company called Agspire. I'm a landowner advisor for Agspire, and explaining what we do is kind of difficult, but what Agspire does is we create a connection between entities that want to perform environmental services, whether that's big corporations, whatever, private companies, NGOs, want to do things on land that provide environmental services. They want to provide clean water or increase wildlife population or sequester soil carbon. And we connect those entities with farmers and ranchers who can implement them on the ground. And so that's my role, is I provide technical service, and then my team makes the connections with the people who are willing to provide funding to help those practices. So it's really it's a fun job, and it's a vital job. So
Absolutely. And
if
you,
you have interest, I mean, my contact information, I'll have it in there. Jessica has it. So I think I'll go ahead and start with what I wanted to talk about today. Is a fairly controversial topic in some circles, and I fail to understand why it is so controversial at times, but it has become basic science shouldn't become political, I guess, but it seems to in our climate. And I'm going to open this up here and start here. If I can get a slideshow and at the beginning. Okay, so I'm going to explain how agriculture. Jessica, can you see my screen there?
yeah,
Are we
everything
good?
looks, yeah,
Okay.
looks great.
I did it right for once. So that someone mark red letters on the calendar today, because I actually got it done right. So I'm going to talk about how agriculture is the solution to climate change and all of other society's ills. So now I started out, climate change for some reason is a controversial topic, and one of the demographics that seems to be the least believing in climate change are farmers. And why is that? And well, one reason is that we make our living by the weather, and we know that a 10-day forecast is maybe 50% accurate, and now we're getting forecast for 50 years, and for some reason they're 100% certain of what's going to happen 50 years from now, when they can't get it right 10 days from now. So that's a reason for skepticism. Another one is, when I was in grade school, back when we carried stone tablets, we were told that we were entering another ice age. Now the same scientists are telling us that we're warming up. So, we've been down this road before. Another thing is maybe some people have seen the headlines that one major scientific journal has retracted 521 articles that they had in their journal because they're forged. 521, because so much of science these days is bought and paid for. So we're very skeptical of who's paying for a lot of this research. Where's it coming from? What's the motivation? We've become very distrustful of science, and for good reason in many cases. And another one is that we don't, in general, trust big government. It seems like, and sometimes it's not the idea of climate change that we disbelieve. It's the proposals, because if you really want to become wealthy in today's world, you invent a crisis and then put yourself in the position of being the savior of that crisis. And so, again, we've seen these things happen over and over again. And the solution always seems to be that we hand over money or power to somebody else. And so there are reasons we are very distrustful of people who are proposing climate change solutions. So I'm going to put up what I call the climate change decision-making chart. So sometimes when you go to choose a course of action, you put, okay, what are the possibilities? What are the courses of action? So there's two possible realities: one, that climate change is a myth; the other is that climate change is real. Okay, it's one or the other. And then choices of actions. We can either do nothing, or we can do something. Okay, so what happens under each of these scenarios? So, it's 50-50, you got on this chart 50-50, whether it's myth or it's real, and then do nothing or do something. So if climate change is a myth and we do nothing, okay, obviously no harm. We just get to make fun of all the silly climate alarmists. So you guys weren't as smart as you thought you were, trust science, yeah. We get to make fun of people. That's the complete and total upside of that scenario. You get to make fun of people. Okay, but what if climate change is real and we do nothing? Well, we're looking at some sort of apocalyptic scenario here. It's going to be like a Mad Max movie out there, and we're starting to see, if you look at the drought map, southwest Kansas looks like the Sahara Desert, rainfall wise. Is this a 1-year blip, 2-year blip, 3-year blip, or is it the new normal? I hope it's not the new normal, but it seems like these 100-year droughts are happening every 10 years now, or more frequently, 3 years out of 10 now. And if you trust the United Nations, if you look at the United Nations IPCC report, this is what they're predicting. You look at that temperature change, and that's not degrees Fahrenheit, that's degrees Celsius, which is bigger, almost twice as big per degree. And now here's my surest sign that climate change is actually, and I talk to a lot of farmers. They say, well, I don't believe in that climate change stuff, but man, the weather sure is funny lately. Here is my surest sign that climate change is occurring, because this is what a possum looked like when I was a kid in Kansas. This is what possums look like now in Kansas. They've grown shells. The range of armadillos has been moving north. You see the dark one, that's where armadillos used to be back in the 50s. The dark gray, or the slightly, that's the 70s, and then the light colored ones, the 90s. And now we have armadillos in Nebraska. And the limiting factor that prevents armadillos from moving northward is how hard does the ground get frozen how deep does the ground freeze in the winter? Because they have to burrow in the winter deeper than the frost line. And so how cold it gets in the winter, which is kind of an average temperature, how deep does it freeze limits the northward expansion of armadillos. And you can see our winters are getting warmer. Armadillos tell us that. So, and then what if climate change is real and we do something? Well, then we're heroes. We save life on Earth. I mean, we can be in that position if we simply choose to do so. And so why do you buy insurance in case the unthinkable happens? We would spend money on insurance just in case. We don't know something's happened, but if something really bad happens, we want to be covered. And I think the same way about climate change, because if climate change is a myth and we do something, well, that depends on what if climate change is, and we go to all this work and it just turns out to be a big farce. Well, it depends a lot on what we do. Now, if the measures we take to fight climate change are some of those that I hear proposed, let's jack up the price of gas to $20 a gallon or whatever, and let's go back to a pre-fossil fuel world. And I mean, we're going to work a lot of economic hardship on people. But what if what we did to fight climate change eliminated famine, floods, droughts, made farmers more money, cleaner water, cleaner air, healthier food, more wildlife? Wouldn't that be great? What if the measures we took made things a better world? So, Jessica, why don't we stop here for a bit and kind of open up discussions, comments? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Should I
this is
keep rolling, or do we want to stop and talk a bit here?
I really like the way that you open up this conversation. I think that it's very common sense, and very few times do we hear common sense talk about this. And I think that what you're doing is you're introducing a topic that I think, from my vantage point and the work that I get to do with PrairieFood is we are seeing a lot change, and maybe just honing that in on the armadillo. But what does that, and I'm sure you're going to get into this, so tell me if I'm getting ahead of you, but what does that actually mean to farmers and ranchers when there's more armadillos? I mean, not literally more armadillos, but not having that winter like we used to. I live in Manhattan, Kansas, and even in 2019, when I first moved here from the Pratt area, my kids actually didn't have snow attire, like they didn't have snowsuits, because when we lived in Pratt, we never needed them. And then when I moved to Manhattan, I had to get everybody outfitted. But then this past year, we've had one snow in town, So yeah.
And people say, great, it's we don't have to, drive through the snow anymore. It changes things. Well, one thing is I've seen trees bloom in the dead of winter. I've seen trees blooming now in December. Of course, that means there's no seed crop the following year because they're going to get whacked at some point. Another thing is it used to be wet in the spring because we'd get snow and the snow would melt, saturate the ground. So we used to deal with wet springs. Now that's a problem if you're wanting to get corn in the ground. People say, well, this is great. It's great if you're trying to winter cattle, but then you don't have moisture for spring green up.
Yeah.
And we have so much higher evaporation rates over the winter than what we used to. It's a soil moisture issue. Now our rainfall in eastern Kansas, if you look at a 30-year trend, eastern Kansas has gained about 2 inches of rainfall, but we're not any wetter because the evapotranspiration rate's gone up. Western Kansas, southwest Kansas has lost 2 inches of annual rainfall. Eastern Kansas found it apparently. But in western Kansas, you lose 2 inches of annual rainfall and you get much hotter, warmer, drier temperature conditions in the winter. You can't bank soil moisture over the winter like you used to. It is a big deal. It's not just, yay, I get to go out in t-shirt and shorts in the winter in Kansas now. Talking to people in South Dakota last week, and they said, or earlier this week, I guess, and they said, we're in a blizzard. I said, we're 87.
Yeah.
Hey.
Well, and go ahead, Darren. Darren had a question too, but I'm excited to hear about emissions, but go ahead, Darren.
Well, I will try to keep my position as chief heckler here, as Brian would say, but I don't know if it's more of a question or a comment, but so the climate has always changed, right? I mean, okay, so does the path we're going down here, Dale, does that change any, whether it's a man-made climate change versus a natural occurring?
A lot of, natural climate change, and it has, there were glaciers in, Wamego, Kansas 10,000 years ago. The big, huge ice sheet, you get north of Wamego, Manhattan. So obviously the climate has changed since then. What has changed now is the pace of change. You saw how far those armadillos have moved north in just 70 years. That's a huge change. And the ability of natural vegetation to adapt to that and what my observation is that probably summers have not changed dramatically as far as temperature. Winters have definitely gotten warmer. Rainfall patterns have shifted somewhat, but I think every farmer that watches would agree that our rainfall is getting less frequent and more severe.
Yeah, I just heard a
I
report
haven't
about
talked to
that this
anybody that
morning.
disagrees with that statement.
Yeah, so it may or may not be a huge shift in annual precipitation, but what I've had producers report back to us is that those rainfall events come down a lot faster with a lot more rain, and they're fewer and far between. So it
Yeah.
absolutely makes it hard. But talk about, let's talk about, I heard a quote, and you might be going there, that even if we stopped all emissions today, 100% of emissions, that it would still take 200 years to get back to pre-1970s. You know, so are we actually making, and I'd probably have to source that, you know, just know that was Jessica's
Well, let's go
version
through
of
the
the
math.
quote.
Yeah,
Let's do it. I'm
You're setting
interested.
me up for a sec. You're like holding a shoehorn here, and I'm about ready to stick my foot in that shoe. So
Got it.
let's walk through some of the math here. So if we were to, you know, two ways to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. First of all, stop emissions. The problem with stopping emissions is that our entire world lifestyle for a good chunk of the world is based on the availability of fossil fuel. It's how we heat our homes. It's how we get around. It's how we get to work. And if we focus solely on stopping emissions, not saying that we shouldn't focus on that, but if we said no more fossil fuel use tomorrow, it's catastrophic. I mean, it will cause weeping, and what does it say in the Bible? Weeping and gnashing of teeth. You know, it's because you're going to see this sort of situation, you know, just fuel prices. The other way, however, of fighting this is to take carbon dioxide. Even if we stopped emissions, we've got all that CO2 in the air. Let's, the other way is take it out of the air and put it into soil. And so these two soil samples are right across the road from each other. One's farmed one way and the other's farmed to put carbon in the ground. Obviously, you can see so much better carbon. And the basic industries, you know, farming, fishing, forestry, mining, and I have a canvas. Everything we have comes to us from this. And I'll talk a little bit about economy here, why it's important. But basically, I've got, I'll skip over this because this is, but when you put carbon in the soil, and this was basically all wealth originally comes from soil, at least in this state. Farming, fishing, forestry, or mining, they all originate from soil. And the farming, fishing, and forestry are all biological activities that require carbon in the soil to really function well. If we put more carbon in the soil, we reduce flooding. And like how much damage, this is the Coffeyville in 2007, I believe it was, flood. You know, it's insane how much this state of Kansas, you know, which is not a real water covered state, how many millions of dollars every year we spent on dredging reservoirs because of flooding, road damage due to flooding. Every time it rains 2 inches, seems like creeks come out of their bank and tear stuff up. And of course, soil carbon helps prevent drought because of the water holding capacity. You get more carbon in the soil, more life in the soil, everything functions better. Now, can we Is it possible? Because I hear arguments, I hear scientists arguing both ways that, oh, you cannot possibly pull enough. Let's take a look. Okay, the current carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, about 870 trillion tons. Trillions? Yeah, that's billion tons. 875 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. And about roughly a third of that has been added since the beginning of the industrial age. So it's this added amount that's causing the problem. It's thickened the blanket that prevents heat from leaving the atmosphere. But that's all been blamed on fossil fuel. But one source of CO2 in the atmosphere that nobody seems to talk about is soil tillage. Because beginning with, essentially the conquest of the New World by Europeans, we've had this big, massive plow up of North and South America. And when you plow up all those grasslands, all the CO2, all the carbon that's in that, not all of it, but most of it, gets oxidized and goes into the atmosphere. And that has added that much additional CO2 on top of what we have with fossil fuel use. And until about the 1970s, the amount of CO2 from tillage exceeded that from fossil fuel use. It's only been recently, that last 50 years, that fossil fuel derived CO2 passed tillage derived CO2. So, and that's just in the New World alone. When you till soil, and this big tall bar here is moldboard plow, and then we got disc harrow, chisel plow, and no-till. Look at how much less CO2 evolves out of the soil with no-till.
That's not insignificant. And perhaps our speaker, maybe it was so significant that our speaker froze up.
He went out on a high note.
He did go on a high note. So, I mean, I'm not even going to attempt to pick up where Dale left off there on tillage, but I think that this being a person that lives in Kansas, we talk frequently, we learn about in school when you're younger about the Dust Bowl, but yet at the same time, we see evidence of Dust Bowls that are still happening today. In fact, I was just on social media yesterday, and you'll see videos and images of places in Southwest Kansas that are not quite completely blacked out from Dust Bowl, but pretty darn close. Do you see that too, Drew? It's amazing.
I have noticed that as well. It's especially when I go back to visit my parents in Stafford, it's just the stark contrast that you see going from east to the central part where, they've been getting rain up around Lawrence, Kansas City, and to the detriment of too much maybe this year, but just the contrast of the rivers and the wetlands going there and how bone dry they are, and it feels alarming to me at this point.
Yeah, thanks for sticking that in the chat, Ron. If you if you're on LinkedIn or Facebook, our good buddy Nick Vos, he's in Liberal. I think he's in Liberal. He posts frequently some images about the current state of the Dust Bowl, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. So now this is a fun time for me, because since our speaker yes, Mike, what's up? Mike from Iowa City. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. One of the things we've seen here in Iowa is kind of imported from Kansas and Nebraska, and it's called the dry line. Mm-hmm. Used to be the 100th meridian was kind of the dry line, where if you were west of that, you had to irrigate. If you're east of that, you could do dry land farming and count on the rain. Well, we've had persistent drought in western Iowa for over 10 years. Just like in the West, their persistent drought west of the Rockies is 22 years now, going on a 23rd year. So we've seen farmers in Western Iowa start installing pivots.
Oh,
They
wow.
have to irrigate now to grow corn and beans. And we never saw that before. So sure, weather changes, but this is a long-term thing, and this is man-made. And it's changing the way that Iowans farm, and I'm sure it changes the way that Nebraskans and Kansas and even Missouri farms as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate your support, and for always being there for us. Mike always comes to all of our events. So Dr. Tricia Jackson is our regenerative ag director for PrairieFood. And so as we wait for Dale Strickler to get back on the line, I wondered if I could introduce you and have you give a little bit of what you have been studying in terms of soil health and how you have seen things change along the way.
Hi, everybody. Glad to see you. I'm reminded I want to talk a little bit more about something else, Jess. Sorry. So I'm a soil scientist. I was trained at KU, which is a unique experience for soil scientists in general. But in my master's program, I was working with a climatologist, and it was his mission to make sure that we were looking more at land use. And this is what Dale was talking about. At that time, in our work on the global climate model, they treated soils as the same across the whole earth. They were 1 meter thick and just the same. And we understand, and we understood back then too, that there was all this dynamic between the soil, and it was influencing atmospheric dynamics, huge impact. And they measured it, and they knew that it was happening. And so since that time, they've made a concerted effort to do better, to build a global data set of soils so that we can understand that dynamic better. And that's improved the global climate models tremendously since then. So I wanted to share that.
Yeah, let's bring that on home too, to Kansas. I mean, what are some parameters that a producer might be familiar with that they could kind of think about in terms of how our soils have changed in the last?
Fantastic question. So in that modeling, they use physics, right? It's all based on physics. So things that they look at are things like reflectivity. If you plow up a soil, it's going to be really dark and black, and it's going to absorb a lot of heat, just like if you're wearing a black t-shirt on a sunny day versus a white t-shirt. And so you get this lift in the atmosphere because the earth is actually heating up the atmosphere from the bottom. And so it creates more thunderstorms, and you're losing moisture and you're heating up the ground. Other things they look at is what is that volume of soil that's collecting things like carbon and water. And so the depth of the soil really matters as well. So what farmers can do is build soils, keep that soil covered so it's cooler. It's not heating the atmosphere from below. It's keeping your crop cooler. It's keeping all your little buddies in the soil, all the microbes that are doing you lots of services. It's keeping them cool so that they can thrive. But then if you're building that volume of soil, you can then keep the water in there, keep the carbon in there, and that's all having a major impact on the atmospheric dynamics in your little world, part of the world. And so if we all do that, we're building that better dynamic, but then you're also influencing the small water cycle in your little region. So I'm going to pass it back to Dale on that because he's the man.
I apologize. I have never had this happen to me. So this is a sure sign of global warming, okay? Because I had my phone, I'm hotspotting off my phone, and I had it sitting on the seat where the sun is streaming in, and it
got too
overheated
hot
and shut down. So I had to real quick pop it out of its case and grab an ice cube out of my drink and cool it down, emergency measure to save it, I guess. So
well, Dr.
then I
Trish
had to log
Jackson to the
back in.
rescue.
So I hope you had a good conversation while I was gone here.
We got it all figured out, Dale.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll log off then.
No, okay, you can keep going. What we were just kind of bringing it home, just kind of reiterating some of your saying, but feel free by all means, take it away.
Okay. Okay. Am I sharing again?
I don't see it yet.
Okay.
but-
Well, hold on. Let me share. Okay. Should be looking.
There we go.
Okay. There we go. Now I go back to slideshow from this slide. Okay. Look good?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay. Well, wait a minute. This is sorry. I shared the wrong screen. I've got too many of these stupid presentations up.
That's okay. That's what we were kind of talking
Here-
about while you were gone, was the impact to the small water cycle. And I saw Pamela had some questions to that.
Yeah.
So we'll absolutely relevant.
Okay, I am going to.
Well,
Here we go. This is the screen. Sorry, I
Yes.
don't usually have this much issue. Kind of flustered here. Okay, now are we at carbon math?
Yep, that looks good.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. So each 1% increase in soil organic matter, top 6 inches of soil, is 10 tons. To create 10 tons of soil organic matter, it takes the carbon from 18 tons of atmospheric carbon dioxide. If you take the 20 billion acres that we have worldwide of agricultural land times 18 tons, that means if you increase soil organic matter across all the world's agricultural area 1 percentage point, that's 360 billion tons. And if you remember, the amount added since the beginning of the industrial age was 240. That's 1 percentage point increase in soil organic matter takes out 50% more than what we put in over the last 200 years. Oh, we could start another. I mean, if we really did what we know how to do already, we don't need a new invention or anything, some sort of world prize. We know how to do this. It's easy. It's photosynthesis does this. CO2 plus water in the leaf of a plant and sunlight, it takes CO2 out of the air. And then it puts it into liquid carbon. Now, here is something relatively new discovery, is that we used to think soil organic matter was driven by the decay of plants. It's not. It's driven by the microbial utilization of root exudates as a food source. That's why it's hard to increase soil organic matter. When I was in college, they said it's impossible to economically increase your soil organic matter. Don't even try it. Just try to maintain what you have. And maybe we'll be able to farm 100 years before we are no longer able to raise food. How cynical. We can raise soil organic matter. And the way we do it is with these root exudates. The key is to have a maximal amount of root exudates in the soil and do it over. How do you maximize root exudates? One is, instead of having a corn soybean rotation over most of the country that only uses sunlight and produces root exudates for about 3 or 4 months out of the year, we have something green and growing all year round. So here's a rye cover crop that was planted after corn harvest. And then that rye the next spring can make a mat that suppresses weeds. So we don't, and that mat, all that residue also reduces Flooding, you can see the runoff here. We don't get runoff, we don't get flooding, so we don't have flooding issue. Reduces weed problems. You see where the cover crop was to the left, there are no weeds. Look at the abundance of weeds over there. We don't need to apply glyphosate. You know where we get most of our glyphosate now? This guy. We get it from President Xi in China. Most
getting ready
of
to
our
drink it?
herbicides now. Yeah, it's so healthy for us you can drink it. Yeah, so toasting this with a glass of glyphosate. Well, our glass probably contains glyphosate, but we are dependent upon this regime for so many of our agricultural inputs. It's rather scary. And of course, these cover crops also provide us economic opportunities like grazing. And here's grazing in the summertime. And another thing, you know, past couple of years, farmers have been really pinched by fertilizer prices, or kicked, however you want to put it. But, you know, the price of nitrogen fertilizer in particular has become rather alarming. And guess where we get our nitrogen fertilizer? This guy. I mean, about 10% of our nitrogen fertilizer comes from here. You want to know who's paying for Russia's war effort? Take a wild guess. Nitrogen fertilizer purchases. Good
It's
chunk
us.
of it. It's us.
It's us.
You know, we're looking for the problem. Who's buying bombs and bullets to kill Ukrainians? We are. Sad but true. Now, every, you know, first day in agronomy, you learn that nitrogen makes grass grow. You know, we've got plots here to the left. We got 0, 50, 100, 200 pounds of nitrogen. We need nitrogen fertility, but we don't necessarily need nitrogen fertilizer. We don't need big N controlling our lives, especially when a lot of that big N is coming from the Middle East or Russia, you know, folks that really don't care about our national security. And nitrogen fertilizer has some dark sides to it. And I've just learned of another dark side. Number one, nitrate can get into groundwater. That's causing some big issues. Another really even more ugly issue than nitrate in groundwater, we're finding, I just saw a research paper earlier this week, when nitrate moves into groundwater, it brings uranium with it. We're starting to see some toxic levels of uranium all over western Kansas in groundwater. That's a legacy that never goes away. Now, another problem with nitrogen is in water. When it denitrifies and turns into nitrous oxide, that has a CO2 equivalent of 300 as a greenhouse gas. Maybe we're focusing on the wrong gas. Maybe CO2 is not the issue. Maybe it's our use of nitrogen fertilizer that's an issue. Now, it's not that we can't use or shouldn't use nitrogen fertilizer, but we need to completely alter the way we use nitrogen fertilizer. Bogue, Kansas, one of those places, 300 people in Bogue. They had to take nitrate and uranium out of their drinking water, $19 million water treatment plant. Divide $19 million by 300. What do you get? That's their water bill that they have to pay. Someone has to pay. I believe if I do the math right, that's 60 grand per person. That's pretty ugly. That's how much they have to cough up, or someone has to cough up to pay for that thing. And it's a legacy of our mismanagement of nitrogen fertilizer. And we can farm in a different way. We can use, here's the rye cover crop again. Here's just a little chart of how much nitrogen rye cover crop's taken up. We don't need to buy nitrogen from Russia. There's 70 million pounds of nitrogen in the atmosphere above every acre. We just need to use biology to pull it down. Instead of using the Haber-Bosch process that requires methane, also a potent greenhouse gas, A good chunk of the methane in the atmosphere comes from exploration to produce nitrogen fertilizer. We can use legumes, pull that down. This is wheat stubble that is not producing nitrogen, not sequestering carbon, not because there's no photosynthesis out here. Instead of wheat stubble doing nothing, you can have wheat stubble doing this. Now take a look at this. Here is cattle pasture, obviously. We're creating a huge amount of organic matter. You look at all this photosynthetic area above ground, how much root exudates, how much volume, how many pounds of root exudates do you think are happening below ground from all this? Creating soil organic matter, sequestering carbon, and also because all these crops you see in front of you are legumes, we're making nitrogen fertility in a stable form, protein. It's going to slow release, not go into nitrous oxide very readily. And you plant corn next year, and on this field, most of your nitrogen fertility needs are met. And you can, even after that's grazed off, you can put another legume in here. This is hairy vetch, and the hairy vetch is being roller crimped down. No glyphosate needed in this situation. This is actually an organic farm, and he's roller crimping, planting in the same pass. The hairy vetch was planted the previous fall. It could follow up that grazing crop that I just showed you. And the hairy vetch not only provides nitrogen for this guy, what do you not see in this field? There are no weeds. And this is an organic no-till farm. How amazing is this? So instead of buying nitrogen from this guy, you can get it from the air. How cool is that? Isn't biology wonderful? Now, if we really want to get serious about sequestering soil carbon, by far the best vegetation for sequestering soil carbon is native warm season grasses. The vegetation that was here before we decided that we could do better than this with a plow. And so grassland farming is by far a better choice, at least in the short term, for sequestering soil carbon than forests. Forests take so long to get going. Now, a 200-year-old forest will have a lot of standing carbon in the wood, but it takes decades for them to get there. We may not have decades. The fastest way to do it short term is perennial grass. Why? Because of root exudates. Now I've got a comparison, paired comparison, several months here. To the left, in each of these pairs, to the left is a wheat plant, to the right is a perennial relation to wheat, which is intermediate wheatgrass. These are from the Land Institute. The red arrow here shows you the wheat. It's non-existent. It hasn't been planted yet. We plant wheat in October. So there is no wheat root system there producing root exudates. But look at that perennial. Okay, here's the next month. Just a tiny little root system here. And then you've got March, some, but nothing like the perennial. And then here you've got wheat at harvest time. There's a root system there, but it's dead already. But look at that perennial. Huge volume pumping out, a huge volume of root exudates. And the soil organic carbon, after you make the switch from crops to pasture, boom, look at that rise in carbon in the soil. And just here's a personal one. I took a field when I was farming. I took an irrigated corn soybean field. I dug a trench in there because I was putting in water lines, and I took a picture of the trench through this field. And that white arrow is where the roots stopped. Before it was 1.9% organic matter and no roots below 18 inches. And you see that gray clay there, a sign of no soil structure. I had 18 inches of water holding capacity, 18 inches of nutrient supplying capacity. So what I did is I planted that to perennial grass, eastern gamma grass, inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi, tried to get some biology in there, put legumes in there, alfalfa and clover and trefoil, and some deep-rooted forbs. And here is that same soil 15 years later, 8.7 organic matter, 7-foot root zone. And that yellow arrow, that fiberglass white fence post I stuck in the ground, that's as deep as the roots used to go. So this is a trench 6 feet away from that previous trench. We can sequester soil carbon. And then water. Once we start altering our soil, we start changing things as far as water infiltration. We can get water moving down into the ground. This is a pretty ugly testimony to how limited lifespan irrigation has in the high plains and the Ogallala Aquifer. We don't have many years left of irrigation. What happens when this whole area basically gets, the agriculture gets abandoned because we're out of irrigation water and our soils are so depleted that it can't support dryland agriculture either? Well, once you change the infiltration characteristics and the water holding capacity with soil carbon, things start happening. This is a friend of mine. He's down by Hereford, Texas. He planted 11,000 acres of irrigated corn ground back to native grass. And the water level in his wells is going up. Now, when you start layering all these things, and I think this is the most fascinating field of agriculture and maybe the most important. We've always thought that the only thing we could do for drought was pray for rain. And some people who have faith believe that you can affect rain. And I do believe in the power of prayer, but I think we are praying for the wrong thing. We're praying for the wrong thing. If you've ever had kids go to college and ask you for money, and the first time they ask you, can I have $1,000? Okay. And then a week later, can I have another $1,000? And you say, wait a minute, what do you do with the last 1,000 I sent you? You're not very charitable. The second go round, said, quit wasting the money I send you. Learn to be more efficient with what you're given. So instead of praying for rain, we should be praying for wisdom. How do you use that rain? You know, instead of praying for rain, you should be praying for a copy of the Drought Resilient Farm for Christmas. So put that on your list. There you go. Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, put that on your Christmas list, because I do think that when you take action to help your situation, you will be favored with blessings. When you take action to steward the resource, good things will happen. We were put here to take care of this planet. And instead of praying for rain when our soils are beaten up and we're responsible for that, I think it's kind of insulting to pray for rain when we have done that to our situation. So the thing is, we can alter rainfall. The problem is we've been altering it to the negative. So what causes rainfall? We're just kind of learning what causes rainfall. I was taught in school that there's a little tiny speck of dust in the center of every drop of rainfall, and it's a condensation nuclei. That's not actually true. For rainfall to happen, we have to have two things. We have to have moisture, I guess three things, and moisture in the air. That comes from transpiration. Transpiration, by and large, transpiration or evaporation. Transpiration comes from vegetation, pumping water out of the soil. Then we have to have cooling, and that can either come from going up or it can come from a cold front. And we have to have condensation nuclei. What we've discovered is that when this slide basically illustrates when we get rid of vegetation, When we have big areas of bare soil, we don't have transpiration anymore. And that's easy to see. We lose the transpiration effect. And so we don't get the moisture in the atmosphere. And some other negatives of having large bare areas as well. I'll hit that. When we plowed all this grassland, we lost all that vegetation. On Pacific Islands, they have proven that when neighboring islands, one deforested and the other not, the rainfall stays the same on the vegetated one, but drops precipitously, so as much as 75% on the defoliated one. We have largely created our own drought through vegetation management. But another thing happens. Not only do we lose that transpiration, but this is a thermometer showing the air temperature at a field day. This is the temperature of bare soil on the same day, 20 degrees hotter. And this is a cover crop soil, same day, 20 degrees cooler than air, 40-degree difference. Now we talk about we talk about global warming, and you know, there's all kinds of evidence that it is occurring, but what's causing it? And we blamed it on CO2. And CO2 has gone up as global temperatures have gone up, but is that the entire story? If you have 20 billion acres of agricultural land with a 40-degree temperature difference compared to vegetated land, you think maybe that has an effect on global temperatures? How could it not? Maybe part of global warming is the way we're farming, not necessarily the amount of CO2 in the air. Although I'm sure that has an effect, but this is very simple, straightforward physics here, people. Okay. One other thing that all this bare soil does, when you have this warming temperature from bare soil, you create heat domes, and heat domes tend to push precipitation away. This expanding air, hot, dry air, pushing rain clouds away from where you are. And when you have this bare area, you also get this haze, this brown haze. You get dust particles. Research in China and Australia have shown that when you put dust in the air, it actually reduces precipitation. To create precipitation, you need condensation nuclei. That's particles that pull, that are hygroscopic, that are attracted to water, and soil particles aren't very good at it. If soil particles are your main source of precipitation, you will get, guess what? It takes huge amounts of moisture to make it rain, which doesn't happen very often. So you'll get very infrequent, but very intense rainfall.
So
When
Dale, go
dust
back to that last slide. Go back to that last slide, because that's what we were talking about when you were gone. So this time of year, as producers are, you know, prepping their seed beds to plant as they've been told, are you saying that without that condensation nuclei attracting water vapor, and as they're releasing the carbon in the air, as the dust particles and soil particles are in the air, we're actually deflecting some of our own spring rains?
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, we have been affecting the climate for thousands of years. And as we have, I have a saying that I like to spout, and it's that speed is a liability if you're going in the wrong direction. And we think we've gotten so efficient in agriculture because we have big machinery. You go to a machinery show, and every year the size of the equipment gets bigger, the things that the equipment pulls gets bigger, and the price tag gets bigger. Are we becoming more and more efficient? If we're using that equipment to pull tillage tools, we're getting faster and faster and faster at going the wrong way. Speed's a liability if you're going in the wrong direction. So what does make good condensation nuclei? Well, as it turns out, mushrooms. Fungal spores are good they're called biotic, what is the term? I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank here. Biotic precipitation, I believe, or biotic aerosols that trigger rainfall. Fungal spores are a big one. And here's just the top set of photos here are, like very microscope photos of pollen grains. And that little expanding white circle there is blue, and the bottom one is water vapor that's condensing on that. When these go up in the air, pulls water vapor towards it, boom. It was plant pathologists, one from Louisiana State, another one from Montana State, who first discovered this link between fungal spores triggering rain. And one of the fungal spores that they were actually looking at were wheat pathogens. They were tracking the movement of these spores in the air to predict when diseases would happen on the wheat crop. And it turned out when the spores arrived, rain would arrive. And of course, two things that, the disease triangle for a plant disease, you have to have a susceptible host, wheat. You have to have the disease agent, and then you have to have favorable conditions, which is moisture, rainfall. The fungal spore creates the rainfall it needs in order to thrive. How amazing is that? So fungal spores are a condensation nuclei. Bacteria that inhabit leaves, this is Pseudomonas syringae. This is one of the most effective condensation nuclei, and again, needs moisture to thrive. So it goes in the air, becomes airborne, creates rainfall, falls back to the plant as rain to infect the plant again. Nature is amazing. I mean, so the bottom line is, and there's some other condensation nuclei we could talk about. They're volatile organic carbons that, like from pine trees, aromatic trees, sagebrush, things like that you have a smell. And there are some plankton that live off whale feces that produce rainfall from the oceans. So, but bottom line is here, we have no shortage of options to pull CO2 out of the air and put it into long-term storage. And so, we started out with, what if climate change is a myth and we do all this for nothing? Well, it's not for nothing. When we put carbon in the soil, we get more money in farmers' pockets, which leads to stronger rural economies. We get better food and fiber infrastructure. We eliminate floods and droughts, those natural disasters, all these things. Everything just ends up better, and we just create a happier, more peaceful, serene environment, and everything's covered in flowers and butterflies. So what a wonderful world. So
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dale. As you guys can see, his contact information's here on the screen. And then I think Drew also stuck it in the chat. We do have some time for some questions. If anybody has any questions for Dale, feel free just to either stick them in the chat, or you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and just ask Dale the question directly. I think that this is so impactful, your presentation. I know you just gave it to the joint committee on conservation in Topeka here recently, and there was kind of a big buzz that we're really shifting a mindset here in agriculture and in farming. And I've known you for many years, Dale, and it's exciting to see how rapid things are starting to improve and advance. What's your greatest hope right now? Are we moving into the next phase of this movement? Do you think we're going to see faster adoption?
I think we are. I think I'm starting to see a mindset shift. The first thing that has to change is attitude, minds. The biggest compaction layer, they say, is between the ears, and nothing happens until people decide that it needs to happen. And we're in the it needs to happen stage. People are starting to become aware, just the Kansas water office coming out this year and saying, we need to do something about this Ogallala aquifer. Really? You think so?
Yeah, exactly. Where have you
That's been
been?
about 40 years too late in coming. It's like maybe we ought to start looking at ways to extend the life of this aquifer. Absolutely we do. And that's such a welcome change. And of course, people have been saying it privately. It's not that they're stupid people. They're not. They're very intelligent people. But there's been such a risk to state these things publicly before. Now people, there's just common realization that we've created ourselves a pretty bad situation, and we need to get out of it, or we're going to face some pretty dire consequences. And just basically the entire, we're looking at a major depopulation and a crashing of the economy in western Kansas if we don't do something about the Ogallala aquifer. We've known that for years, but it has been just recently that people are stating it publicly without fear of, being tracked down by a mob carrying torches and pitchforks.
Yeah. Yeah. We've already seen, well, it's the history of civilization. I know David Montgomery and Anne Bickley have several books that they've authored on. They authored their first one, Dirt, which they horribly regret naming it Dirt. They should have called it Soil. And so, yeah, we're looking at climate refugees, and we've already seen that not only in previous, not necessarily generations, but we're seeing that right now in countries across the entire world. And it could clearly happen in the United States as Western Kansas loses its ability to have water, and not just water for farming, but water to live. Yeah, Frank, you had a question or a comment you wanted to add?
Al, I'm Frank Egan. I'm down in Australia, southeast New South Wales, up on the Monaro country, sheep operation. Just only a small place, 300 acres, but over the last 15 years, what you were saying about going back to native species, we have proved that beyond reproach with our place. And it's a mixture of, because they've been trying to pasture improve our place for 50 years before we bought it. And every time they got a dry spell, all the modern species all died, because you've got to have rain on them every 2 weeks, otherwise they don't perform. So, so we had these remnants, the survivors of their, so we had some flaris and cocksfoot, I think he called orchard grass, ryegrass, and clovers, and so our place has had no superphosphate for 25 years. And this year, as we go into winter, and I'm looking around the district, the sheep nut feeders and the hay bales are out already. As the pastures start to grow off, and we're still growing green feed. And like I say, we've had the same rainfall as everybody else, and they got virtually no feed, and we're going to have plenty, especially in the woodlands. I think that's underrated, the idea of woodland grazing, and we've shown on our place using native species that it's a winner.
Yeah,
I think silvopasture, which if for those not familiar with the term, but silviculture is the growing of trees, and pasture, of course, is grazing livestock. The integration of growing trees and pasture underneath those trees, kind of a savanna sort of system, is called silvopasture. I think that is the highest and best use of land. And especially if those trees are producing an edible product for either human, some sort of product. Lumber is okay, but food is better. And or feed, and the use of trees that drop feed for livestock. One of the book I read in college that completely changed my entire perspective on how agriculture around the world should be conducted. It's a book called Tree Crops.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in agriculture should be required to read the book Tree Crops. Even if all
Yeah.
you do is read the first couple chapters and the last chapter, it will change the way you see the world and your role in it.
I like Ron's comment. Ron said, nothing like farming trees to get your neighbors talking. That is, well, and so I have a couple examples of that, and then we'll probably try to wrap up here at 1:15. I know that there's a group that's promoting tree cropping, and they're doing that with chickens, and they're doing that with hazelnuts, elderberries, cover crops, chickens, and then eggs, and then meat. And so they've got several canopies that start down in the soil profile down in the soil food web. So that's Reginaldo Haslett Marquin is doing tree cropping. And then who's our friend that we met in Lawrencedale? His name, Mark Shepard. Yes. He
Mark
was
Shepard.
another one. Yeah, that was another one that,
Yeah, Restoration Agriculture.
yep, that's the name of that book too. So after you've spent your money buying Dale's books, then you can consider buying some of these other books that we're mentioning. But yeah, just in the research that we were doing here in Kansas is trying to figure out ways to gain more support for silvopasture, because you already showed it in your property that you were grazing. You went from 1 point something SOM up to 8.7 SOM. And that's what we've all been told in agriculture, that's not possible.
Yep.
And that leads right into our next guest that's going to be with us next week, Jimmy Emmons from Leedy, Oklahoma. He'll be talking about his soil organic matter, and he's actually had his soils reclassified by NRCS. And one thing that he always talks about is that when somebody say, well, how much rain did you get? His response was all of it. So very excited to hear from Jimmy next week. And Dale, thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you on the
Hey,
call.
I have one final comment. I saw a comment about how to buy my books on Amazon. Please, if you're getting a hard copy, please buy it from my website.
Yes.
Only go to Amazon if you want a Kindle version. I was just explaining to someone from a sale of that drought resilient farm on Amazon, the credit card company will get 75 cents and I'll get 21.
Wow.
I will never, ever in my lifetime sell enough books on Amazon
Yeah.
to pay my advance back. Just will never happen.
Yeah.
I only make money if you buy directly from me.
Okay.
That,
So I think we have
Amazon is no friend to authors.
I've actually heard that before too. So when we send our email out to everybody after this call, it'll probably come early next week. We will be sure to put your website in there.
Yeah. Always, if you can, always try to buy directly from the author.
Yep.
Never from Amazon if you have a choice.
Yep. Well, and then have you done an audiobook? Do you actually read any of your books?
I have not. There's so many photos and charts and graphs.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think it would translate to audio very well.
That makes
That's
sense.
been requested before. I might still do it and try to describe, well, okay, now here's a picture
Yeah.
here of this side looks a lot better than the other side. So,
Well,
but,
I just love,
there's
I
ways
love
around that.
listening. Yeah, my favorite is Nicole Masters, because when she reads her own book, she cusses a little bit, and I think it's fun. I mean, it's so entertaining to listen to her talk about soil, and she has a lot of WTF moments. So, all right, well, thank you everybody for joining us on this call. Super excited to have you on, and it's been a really great informational series. And thank you so much to our speaker, Dale. And everybody enjoy the
Thanks
rest
for
of
the
your Friday.
invitation. So.